Richard stood at the edge of his driveway, the paper in his hand catching the morning light. It was a brochure for a sedan that cost more than his annual salary. The glossy pages felt heavy, almost magnetic. His phone vibrated against his thigh, a sharp, rhythmic buzz that broke the silence of the street. He pulled it out. A text from his friend blinked on the screen. "Treat yourself. You deserve it." Richard looked up. His own car sat a few feet away, its paint dull, a shallow scratch running along the passenger door. He knew the engine. He knew the sound of its ignition. It was reliable. It was finished. Then he looked back at the brochure. The sleek curves and the promise of status pulsed in his mind, an itch he could feel beneath his skin. He checked his bank balance on his phone, the numbers steady and growing, a mountain of security that now felt like a barrier to his own desires. He gripped the steering wheel of his car, the leather worn smooth under his palms. He didn't move. He stood there, trapped between the man he was and the man the brochure promised he could become. He shoved the phone into his pocket and turned away from his reliable scratch sedan. His boots hit the pavement with a rhythmic, heavy thud. Every step toward the dealership felt like a deliberate choice to dismantle the safety he had spent years building. He gripped his current car keys so tightly the metal bit into his palm, a sharp, grounding pain that did little to quiet the urge. He walked past the local grocer, past the familiar turnoff to his office, his eyes fixed on the glass facade 2 blocks away. A delivery truck rumbled past, the exhaust fumes thick and acrid, forcing him to squint and slow his pace. He used the moment to breathe, but the hunger for the upgrade only tightened in his chest. He passed a billboard for high-interest loans and his stomach turned. He was walking directly into the trap he had warned others about. He reached the corner, the dealership lot coming into full view. Rows of pristine machines glinted under the sun, waiting. He slowed his gait, his pulse drumming against his throat. The distance between his current life and the one he craved was shrinking with every passing second. He stood at the edge of the lot, the air suddenly feeling thin, and he forced himself to take one final, agonizing step forward. The glass doors stood open, spilling conditioned air and the scent of synthetic leather onto the sidewalk. Richard stepped across the threshold. The showroom was an assault of high-gloss surfaces and aggressive, sterile lighting. He felt the cold air hit his face, a sudden contrast to the humid street. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the smooth metal of his car keys, preparing to trade them in. Then, the silence of the showroom floor deepened. It was a strange, heavy quiet. In that stillness, a sentence surged to the surface of his mind, a line from the pages of Napoleon Hill he had memorized years ago. "Mastery of the self is the only true wealth." The words echoed with the sharpness of a physical strike. He saw the worn, thin pages of his old notebook in his mind's eye. He stopped. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm that drowned out the hum of the dealership's air conditioning. He looked at the salesman approaching, a smile plastered on a face he didn't know. Richard didn't return the look. He stared past the man, his vision narrowing to the reflection of his own indecision in the glass. The urge to sign the contract clawed at his resolve, but the memory of his own potential held him fast. He was a breath away from surrender. Richard stepped back. The salesman blinked, his rehearsed greeting dying in the air as Richard turned on his heel. He didn't look back at the gleaming rows of steel. He walked fast, his stride lengthening until he was almost running back toward his quiet house. The tension in his chest began to dissipate with every block he put between himself and the showroom. He reached his front door, fumbled with his keys, and entered the dim, cool air of his home. He went straight to his desk. The wood felt solid and familiar under his hands. He opened the heavy ledger that sat waiting in the center of the workspace. The paper was crisp, the ink dark. He found the line labeled for the new car payment. He didn't hesitate. He drew a single thick line through the numbers, the nib of his pen scratching against the grain of the page. He calculated the exact figure and wrote it down again, this time under a new heading: Index Fund Contribution. He closed the book with a sharp thud. That was it. The money was redirected. The urge to upgrade had been surgically removed from his ledger. He sat back, his breath finally evening out, and listened to the silence of a future he had just reclaimed. The calendar pages turned, and the seasons shifted in a blur of gray and green. Richard stayed his course. While his colleagues rushed to the parking lot to show off new arrivals, exhaust pipes still ticking, paint reflecting the sun, Richard drove his reliable, scratched machine with a sense of quiet ownership. He watched them trade bonuses for depreciating metal. He watched the cycles of debt tighten around them. In the office, the talk was always of the next upgrade, the next loan, the next status symbol. Richard listened, nodded, and went back to his desk. He tracked his own growth in the dark ink of his ledger. Every month, the index fund balance ticked upward, a silent tally of his restraint. He felt no envy. The gap between his life and theirs widened, not in noise, but in the slow, inevitable accumulation of capital. When the market dipped, they panicked, selling off assets to cover their lifestyle costs. Richard held. He added more. He watched his net worth climb, a slow mountain rising while the ground beneath his peers shifted and cracked. He had learned the language of compound interest, and it spoke to him more clearly than the flash of a new engine ever could. He was building a fortress, one disciplined decision at a time. The offer arrived on a Tuesday, embossed with the company seal and promising a title that carried weight in every boardroom in the country. It required a move to the city, a place of glass towers and exorbitant rents. Richard sat at his desk, the letter open before him, and pulled out his calculator. He broke down the costs: the commute, the taxes, the inflated price of a two-bedroom apartment, the inevitable lifestyle inflation that came with the new status. He cross-referenced these figures with his current venture, a leaner project that kept his overhead low and his independence high. The prestige was tempting, a clear step up the ladder, but the math screamed a different story. He stood up and paced the length of his office, the hum of the air conditioner, the only sound in the room. He looked at his ledger, at the steady, compound growth he had fought years to establish. Taking this promotion would reset his progress, tethering his time to a cycle of high-cost labor. He folded the offer letter, tucked it into an envelope, and placed it in the shredder. He sent a brief, polite email declining the move. He stayed where he was, focused, grounded, and entirely in control of his own overhead. The promotion went to someone else, but Richard kept his most valuable asset, his freedom. The question came on a quiet afternoon. A coworker leaned over the partition, eyes scanning Richard's modest workspace. "You never seem to stress about the budget," the man said, his voice laced with a mix of confusion and envy. "What is the secret? How are you always ahead of the curve?" Richard did not answer with talk of stocks, market trends, or investment strategies. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. He laid it flat on the surface. The coworker frowned, expecting a ledger of gains, but Richard opened it to a random page. It was filled with nothing but dates and the single, repeated word, "no." The coworker leaned in, tracing the ink with his gaze. There were hundreds of entries, each one a specific moment of denial. No to the new car. No to the luxury vacation. No to the vanity upgrade. The coworker stopped, his finger hovering over a line from years prior. He looked up, his expression shifting from curiosity to a sharp, jarring realization. He had expected a magic formula, a hidden trick. Instead, he found a long, exhaustive history of self-denial. The silence in the office grew heavy. The coworker closed the book, his hands slightly trembling as he realized the true weight of the discipline required to build what Richard now possessed. Richard turned the pages until the ink darkened with age. He tapped a specific entry dated 5 years earlier. It read simply, "No to the luxury watch." The coworker stared at the words, unable to reconcile the missed indulgence with the outcome. Richard traced the line with his thumb. "That watch cost $12,000, he said, his voice level. "I wanted it. I stood in the store and held it, but I walked out." He explained how that $12,000, instead of circling his wrist, went into a high-yield account. He waited. He watched the market slide, then he moved. He bought a derelict property at a foreclosure auction using that exact seed money. He described the smell of the dust during the renovation, the weeks spent scraping floors himself, and the final sale that tripled his initial capital. The coworker looked at the notebook again. It was no longer just a list of denials. It was a roadmap of assets. Each no represented a brick, a board, or a deposit. The watch had not just been saved, it had been transmuted. It had become the foundation for a small real estate empire, a physical monument to a single moment of restraint. The coworkers saw the logic clearly now. Wealth was not about the money one made, but about the impulses one successfully ignored. Decades passed with the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock. Richard reached his 50s, and the landscape of his life had shifted entirely. While his former peers were still tethered to the exhausting cycle of living paycheck to paycheck, their bonuses long ago evaporated into depreciating luxury items, Richard stood on different ground. His initial, modest savings had been subjected to the relentless engine of compound interest. It was not a sudden explosion of wealth, but a slow, inevitable accumulation that had gained its own momentum. The index funds, the early real estate ventures, and the disciplined avoidance of lifestyle inflation had converged into a massive, independent fortune. He looked at his peers. They were still trading their hours for temporary comforts, their financial futures remaining fragile and reactive. He, however, saw his accounts reflect a different reality. The numbers on his screens had grown beyond mere survival, forming a buffer that shielded him from every market tremor. It was a stark divide. On one side, the constant anxiety of the next bill. On his side, the quiet, heavy certainty of total financial autonomy. He had not won by earning more than everyone else, but by keeping what he had and letting it work in the shadows year after year, until the sum of his restraint became a mountain of leverage. Richard stepped out onto the balcony. The city spread below him, a vast grid of lights and movement. He poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the cool air. He held a small piece of this landscape, a stake bought with years of deliberate choices. He did not need the luxury car. He did not need the watch. He did not need the validation of those still chasing the horizon. He set the coffee down on the railing and looked out at the skyline. The war he had fought was not against external forces, but against the immediate pull of his own ego. Every no he had uttered was a strike against that inner impulse. Now, the battle was over. He was no longer a passenger to his desires, but the architect of his own schedule. He turned the keys to his own time over in his hand, feeling the cold metal. He had traded immediate gratification for permanent autonomy. He lived exactly the life he had constructed, not the one his impulses had demanded. He watched the horizon, the weight of his discipline resting steady in his chest. He was the owner of his days, the master of his own life, and he had won.